The desert wind howls across the Valley of the Kings on a February night in 1923, and inside a sealed chamber untouched for 32 centuries, Lord Carnarvon leans forward with a candle trembling in his hand. Howard Carter has just broken through a final wall of plaster, and as the flame flickers, gold gleams back at them from the darkness. Statues, chariots, thrones, and at the center of it all, a sarcophagus that has waited since the boy king Tutankhamun was laid to rest. Carnarvon will be dead within weeks. A mysterious infection, a fever that defies treatment, and across the British Empire, newspapers will scream of a pharaoh's curse, reaching across millennia to punish those who dared disturb his eternal sleep. But to understand whether this was vengeance from beyond the grave or a collision of coincidence and ancient belief, we must go back past the flashbulbs and headlines, back to a civilization that believed with absolute conviction that the dead could and would protect what was theirs. If you find yourself drawn into mysteries where history and legend blur together, consider subscribing, because this is only the beginning of a story that stretches across continents and centuries. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with eternity. The Egyptians did not see death as an ending, but as a perilous transition, a journey through the underworld where the soul, the Kai, and the Ba would face trials before reaching the afterlife. Tombs were not simply graves, they were machines built for resurrection, filled with everything a soul might need: food, weapons, servants rendered in painted clay, and prayers etched into stone meant to guide and protect the deceased. To Egyptians, robbing a tomb was not merely theft. It was an act that could unravel the cosmic order itself, condemning the dead to wander forever, hungry and lost, denied the paradise promised to them by Osiris, Lord of the underworld. It is within this worldview that the concept of the tomb curse was born, not as a single dramatic incantation, but as a broader tradition stretching back to the Old Kingdom more than 4,000 years ago. Egyptologists have documented curse inscriptions on tomb walls dating to as early as the 4th and 5th dynasties, around 2600 to 2400 BCE, long before Tutankhamun was ever born. These inscriptions, found in mastabas and rock-cut tombs near Saqqara and Giza, warn potential intruders in language that still carries weight when translated. One funerary text threatens that anyone who enters the tomb with evil intent will be judged by the great God, that their name will be obliterated, and that they will have no heir to carry on their memory, a punishment of almost unimaginable severity to a people who believed that being remembered was a form of survival. These were not idle threats scrawled by frightened priests. They were legal and religious instruments, formal declarations meant to invoke divine justice in a society where the gods were active participants in daily life. Historians such as Alan Gardner, one of the foremost Egyptologists of the 20th century, studied these so-called execration texts extensively, noting that they served both spiritual and practical purposes. Spiritual in their appeal to divine punishment, practical in their attempt to deter the very real and very common crime of tomb robbery. Egypt's elite were buried with staggering wealth, and even in antiquity, this made them targets. Papyrus court documents from the 20th dynasty, roughly 1100 BCE, record actual trials of tomb robbers, men who confiscated funerary equipment and gold, and who were punished with brutal corporal penalties when caught. The curses, then, were not separate from this reality. They were Egypt's spiritual defense system, layered atop physical security measures like sealed doors, hidden passages, and false burial chambers. Now, picture the Valley of the Kings itself, that desolate, sun-scorched gorge on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, chosen specifically because its isolation made it easier to guard, and its geology made it possible to carve deep, hidden tombs into limestone cliffs. For nearly 500 years, from around 1550 to 1070 BCE, this valley served as the burial ground for Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs, men who ruled at the height of Egyptian power, commanding empires that stretched from Nubia to the Levant. Among them, almost forgotten by history until the 20th century, was a teenage king named Tutankhamun, who ascended the throne around 1332 BCE at perhaps 8 or 9 years old, and died roughly a decade later. His cause of death still debated by scholars, with theories ranging from malaria complicated by a bone disorder to genetic complications from generations of royal inbreeding, evidenced by CT scans and DNA testing, conducted in 2010 under the direction of Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass. Because Tutankhamun died young and unexpectedly, his tomb was modest by pharaonic standards, hastily prepared and, crucially, hidden beneath debris from later construction projects, which is precisely why it survived largely intact for over 3,000 years, while the grander tombs of his predecessors were stripped bare by robbers within decades of their sealing. This twist of fate is what made Howard Carter's discovery so extraordinary and so dangerous to the imagination of a world hungry for mystery. Carter had spent years searching the valley, funded by George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, an aristocrat whose passion for Egyptology bordered on obsession. By 1922, Carnarvon had grown frustrated with years of fruitless digging and was ready to withdraw funding. Carter convinced him to support one final season. On November 4th, workers uncovered a stone step cut into the bedrock. Within days, a full staircase was revealed, leading to a sealed doorway stamped with the necropolis seal, the jackal god Anubis presiding over 9 bound captives, a symbol indicating royal burial. Carter sent an urgent telegram to Carnarvon in England, and the Earl rushed to Egypt with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. On November 26, 1922, the moment we opened with took place. Carter made a small breach in the doorway, held a candle to the gap, and when Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Inside lay a treasury virtually undisturbed since antiquity, golden shrines nested within one another, a solid gold funerary mask weighing over 10 kilograms, chariots, weapons, jewelry, and the mummified body of the boy king himself, still resting within his innermost coffin of pure gold. It remains to this day the most complete royal tomb ever discovered in Egypt, and its excavation took nearly a decade to fully catalog and clear. But fame, in this case, arrived hand in hand with fear. Within weeks of the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito on his cheek. He later nicked the bite while shaving, and the wound became infected. He developed blood poisoning, then pneumonia, and on April 5, 1923, just over 4 months after the tomb's opening, he died in Cairo. According to several accounts, including reports published at the time, Cairo experienced a citywide power outage at the precise moment of his death, and back in England, Carnarvon's dog reportedly howled and died as well. These details have circulated for decades, repeated in countless books and documentaries, though historians caution that some elements, particularly the dramatic synchronicity of the dog's death, rely on second-hand reporting rather than verified contemporary records, and should be treated as part of the legend that grew around the event, rather than confirmed fact. What is documented, however, is the media frenzy that followed. The press, particularly sensationalist newspapers competing for circulation, seized upon Carnarvon's death as evidence of a supernatural curse. The novelist Marie Corelli, popular in her time, wrote publicly that she had read an obscure Arabic text warning of dire punishment for anyone who violated a sealed tomb, lending pseudo-scholarly credibility to what was rapidly becoming a media sensation. Reporters scoured Egyptological records and found, or in some cases embellished, an inscription supposedly within the tomb reading, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." Egyptologists who later examined Carter's actual records, including Carter himself, denied that any such inscription existed within Tutankhamun's tomb. This particular curse phrase appears to be an invention, or, at the very least, an unverified addition to the historical record, one of the clearest examples of how legend can attach itself to genuine archaeology and become indistinguishable from fact in the public imagination. And yet, the deaths continued to mount in the public consciousness, whether or not they were truly connected. Within years of the tomb's opening, several individuals associated with the excavation died under circumstances that newspapers eagerly framed as mysterious, including Carnarvon's half-brother, an X-ray specialist who had examined the mummy, and a member of Carter's excavation team. Statisticians and skeptical historians, however, have since pointed out a crucial detail often omitted from sensationalized accounts. Howard Carter himself, the man most directly and continuously exposed to the tomb, lived for another 17 years after the discovery, dying in 1939 at the age of 64 from natural causes, specifically Hodgkin's lymphoma. If any curse existed, it apparently spared the one man who spent more time inside that tomb than anyone else alive. A 2002 study published in the British Medical Journal, conducted by epidemiologist Mark Nelson, examined the lifespans of those present at the tomb's opening compared to others who had traveled to Egypt around the same time but were not present at the unsealing. Nelson found no statistically significant difference in life expectancy between the two groups, suggesting that the so-called curse was, in scientific terms, a pattern imposed retroactively onto ordinary mortality, amplified by the era's appetite for the sensational. If you're enjoying this journey through fact, legend, and the space between them, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment with your own theory. Did ancient belief carry real power, or did human imagination simply find a story too irresistible to let go? Still, dismissing the curse entirely as pure fantasy misses something important about why it took hold so powerfully in the first place. The 1920s were a period of heightened spiritualism in the Western world, partly fueled by grief following the First World War and the global influenza pandemic, both of which had claimed tens of millions of lives. People were primed to believe in forces beyond rational explanation, in messages from beyond death, in unseen consequences for disturbing the sacred. Egyptomania, already simmering since Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, had brought ancient artifacts and imagery flooding into European consciousness, exploded into full cultural obsession after Carter's discovery. Fashion, architecture, film, and literature across Europe and America absorbed Egyptian motifs, and the curse narrative became inseparable from this broader fascination, a ready-made Gothic tale that satisfied a public hungry for mystery rooted in something that felt historically real rather than purely invented. Scholars studying the phenomenon, including Egyptologist Christine L. Maddy and historian Roger Luckhurst, who authored a detailed academic study titled The Mummy's Curse, examining the cultural origins of the legend, have traced how the idea of cursed mummies actually predates Tutankhamun's discovery by decades, emerging from earlier Victorian-era fiction and exhibitions that sensationalized Egyptian artifacts long before Carter ever set foot in the Valley of the Kings. In other words, the curse of Tutankhamun did not create the myth from nothing. It activated and amplified a narrative tradition that Western culture had already been constructing for nearly a century, grafting it onto a genuine and spectacular archaeological event. What remains undeniably real, stripped of sensationalism, is the religious conviction of the ancient Egyptians themselves, who believed with total sincerity that disturbing the dead carried spiritual consequences severe enough to warrant inscribing warnings in stone for thousands of years. Their curses were not Hollywood incantations meant to reanimate mummies or summon ghostly vengeance. They were solemn legal and theological declarations, rooted in a worldview where maintaining cosmic balance, called ma'at, was the highest moral obligation a person could uphold. To rob a tomb was to commit not just a crime against property, but a crime against eternity itself. In the end, The story of Tutankhamun's curse reveals less about ancient magic and more about the enduring power belief holds over human imagination, whether in 1300 BCE Thebes or in 1920s London drawing rooms. The boy king, who ruled for less than a decade and might have remained a footnote in history, became instead one of the most recognized figures of the ancient world, not solely because of the treasures buried with him, but because of the story humanity built around his disturbed rest. Perhaps that, more than any inscription or mosquito bite, is the truest curse and blessing of the pharaohs: the power to reach across millennia and make the living remember them, fear them, and never quite stop wondering what truly lies beneath the sand. If this exploration of ancient belief and historical mystery captivated you, share it with someone who loves a story where history refuses to stay buried, and subscribe for more journeys into the past where evidence and legend meet.